May 6th, 1527. Rome. The sound is the first thing that hits you, not the peal of sacred bells calling the faithful to prayer, but their frantic, discordant clangor, a city-wide scream of hammered bronze. Below, a symphony of damnation, the guttural shouts of German Landsknechte, the crisp commands of Spanish officers, and the unending, high-pitched shrieks of 10,000 souls being torn apart. The air is thick, a foul cocktail of acrid smoke from countless fires, the metallic tang of fresh blood, and the dust of crumbling plaster. This is not a battle, it is the apocalypse. And high above the chaos, on the battlements of the Castel Sant'Angelo, a man is having the time of his life. This is the narrative of him, Benvenuto Cellini, goldsmith, musician, sculptor, and now, artilleryman. He squints, his artist's eye, usually reserved for the delicate curve of a golden nymph, now measuring the trajectory of a cannonball. A puff of smoke, a roar that shakes the ancient stones, and a distant figure of authority on horseback explodes into a red mist. Cellini would later boast, with chilling precision, that he had personally slain the Constable of Bourbon, the leader of this marauding army. In this single moment, the entire man is laid bare. In the heart of the Catholic world's greatest catastrophe, with Pope Clement VII cowering behind him, Cellini the creator finds his ultimate expression in the act of destruction. He is not merely surviving the chaos, he is conducting it, a maestro of death who sees this hellscape as the grandest stage imaginable for his own talent. It is here, amidst the sack of a holy city, that the central question of his life is forged in fire and blood. This was the saga of Benvenuto Cellini, a name that resonates through the halls of art history with the weight of sculpted marble and the glint of polished gold. To understand this man, we must first understand the paradox that consumed him, the very question that our story seeks to answer. How could the same hands that crafted the exquisitely detailed salt cellar for the King of France, an object of such divine harmony that it seems to have been breathed into existence rather than made, also be the hands that drove a dagger into a man's neck over a perceived insult? Why did a genius who could capture the grace of the gods in bronze live a life of such unrelenting, brutal violence, a life he himself chronicled with more pride than remorse? This is the core of the enigma. He was a creator of masterpieces that stand as pillars of the high Renaissance, yet his autobiography reads like the fever dream of a mercenary captain, a litany of brawls, duels, murders, and jailbreaks. Was he a sublime artist, tragically afflicted with a violent temperament, or was he a stone-cold killer who happened to possess an inexplicable gift for beauty? The answer is far more complex and disturbing. To unravel it, we must journey back to the world that birthed such a man, a world where beauty and brutality were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin, where a man's ability to create and his capacity to destroy were seen as the twin measures of his virtue, his power to impose his will upon the world. This is not a story of good versus evil, but of a terrifying synthesis of the two within a single, extraordinary soul. To comprehend a man like Cellini, we must first inhale the air he breathed, a toxic perfume of incense, blood, and ambition. The world of the early 16th century was a fractured mirror, reflecting both the sublime heights of human genius and the darkest depths of human depravity. The Italian peninsula, his home, was not a unified country but a blood-soaked chessboard, the grand prize in a relentless power struggle known as the Italian Wars. Imagine this world, the France of King Francis I, a flamboyant kingdom of chivalry and artistic patronage, locked in a death grip with the sprawling Holy Roman Empire of Charles V, a dour and determined monarch on whose lands the sun never set. Their titanic armies, swelled by ruthless Swiss pikemen, fanatical German Landsknechte, and disciplined Spanish tercios, treated Italy as their personal playground and battlefield. The papacy in Rome, far from being a neutral spiritual authority, was a temporal power in its own right, with a pope who was as much a prince and a general as he was the vicar of Christ. Popes like Clement VII, Cellini's first great patron, made and unmade alliances with cynical speed, playing the great powers against each other in a desperate bid for survival. And beneath this macro-level conflict, the Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, were a nest of vipers, each ruled by powerful families like the Medici, the Sforza, and the Farnese, who schemed, assassinated, and betrayed one another with an artist's flair. This was the world that shaped Benvenuto Cellini. It was a landscape of endemic violence, where a private feud could escalate into a street battle, where mercenaries became dukes overnight, and where the law was a flimsy shield for the weak and a powerful weapon for the well-connected. In such a world, morality was a luxury few could afford. Survival, and indeed success, depended not on piety or righteousness, but on a combination of talent, ruthlessness, and an unshakable belief in one's own destiny. It was a society that lionized the uomo universal, the universal man, who could write a sonnet in the morning, design a fortress in the afternoon, and lead a cavalry charge at dusk. It was a world that did not ask a man to be good. It demanded that he be great, and it rarely questioned the methods he used to achieve that greatness. This violent, glittering, and treacherous crucible was the only world that could have produced a Benvenuto Cellini, for it was a world that saw the flash of his dagger and the glint of his genius as emanating from the same brilliant, terrible light. He was born at the dawn of a new century, in November of the year 1500, in Florence, the very epicenter of the Renaissance. This city was not just his birthplace, it was the anvil upon which his contradictory character was hammered into shape. His father, Giovanni Cellini, was a musician and instrument maker in the service of the powerful Medici family, a man of respectable artistic temperament. He envisioned a future for his son in the genteel world of music, a path of courtly grace and steady patronage. But the young Benvenuto was drawn to a different kind of music, the roar of the furnace, the ring of the hammer on metal, the violent, elemental magic of the goldsmith's workshop. This was the first of his many rebellions, a rejection of his father's wishes in favor of a dirtier, hotter, more demanding craft. This primal conflict set the pattern for his entire life, a constant struggle against any authority that sought to confine his explosive ambition. Florence itself was a school for hard knocks. He grew up in its teeming streets, a labyrinth of narrow alleys where artisan workshops stood shoulder to shoulder with the fortified palazzi of noble families. It was a city of breathtaking beauty and savage factionalism, where artistic rivalries were as deadly as political ones. He learned early that a man's honor was his most prized possession, a fragile thing that had to be defended with fists and, if necessary, with blades. His autobiography is filled with tales of his youthful brawls, describing with undisguised relish how he laid out his rivals. At the age of 16, he was banished from Florence for his role in a public fray, the first of several exiles that would punctuate his life. This experience did not teach him humility. It taught him that the world was a hostile place, and that to survive, one had to be harder and more ruthless than one's enemies. It forged in him a deep-seated resentment of aristocrats and established masters, whom he saw as trying to keep down a man of true, natural talent. His early years were a relentless education in self-reliance, a masterclass in how to navigate a world of patrons, rivals, and thugs. He was learning to be both a creator and a warrior, honing the skills of his craft while simultaneously developing the instincts of a street fighter. The boy who defied his father to become a goldsmith was already becoming the man who would defy popes, kings, and dukes, convinced that his genius gave him the right to forge his own laws. The road to greatness in the Renaissance almost always led to one place: Rome. For a young, ferociously ambitious artist like Cellini, arriving in the Eternal City in his early 20s was like stepping into the heart of a blazing furnace. This was not the tranquil city of ancient ruins we imagine today. It was a sprawling, chaotic, and dangerous metropolis, teeming with pilgrims and prostitutes, cardinals and cutthroats, artists and assassins. It was the center of Christendom's wealth and a cesspool of its corruption, a place where fortunes could be made overnight, and lives could be extinguished in a dark alley for the price of a cheap bottle of wine. It was here, in this volatile environment, that Cellini took his first real step into the great game of power and patronage. He set up his own workshop, and his extraordinary skill quickly set him apart from the crowd of middling craftsmen. His work was different. It possessed a dynamism, a precision, and a flair for dramatic design that was undeniable. Word of the brilliant young Florentine spread through the city's corridors of power. He began to receive commissions for everything from intricate silver caskets to ceremonial dagger hilts, each piece a testament to his burgeoning genius. But it was not just his talent that got him noticed. It was his personality. He was not a humble, deferential artisan. He was proud, loud, and utterly self-assured, a man who carried himself with the swagger of a nobleman. He understood instinctively that, in a city like Rome, talent alone was not enough. One had to project an aura of power and importance. He engaged in public disputes, picked fights with rivals, and cultivated a reputation for being as dangerous as he was brilliant. This combination of sublime skill and a volatile temperament was intoxicating to the city's elite, who were always on the lookout for a new and exciting talent to patronize. His breakthrough came when he entered the service of the papacy, undertaking work for high-ranking cardinals and eventually for Pope Clement VII himself. To work for the Pope was to reach the pinnacle of the artistic world, a position that offered not only immense prestige and wealth, but also a powerful form of protection. It was his official entry into the high-stakes world, where art and power were inextricably linked, a world where he was no longer just a craftsman, but a player. What was the engine that drove this man, the secret motivation that fueled both his celestial art and his infernal rages? To understand Cellini, one must grasp the central, all-consuming concept of his life: virtù. This Italian word is easily mistranslated as virtue, with its modern connotations of moral goodness. But in the Renaissance, virtù meant something far more potent and amoral. It was the quality of a man, a combination of genius, skill, courage, audacity, and the sheer force of will necessary to overcome obstacles and impose one's vision upon the world. It was the power to bend Fortuna, the goddess of luck, to your will. For Cellini, the pursuit and defense of his virtù was the singular obsession of his life. Every masterpiece he created was a testament to his virtù, a proof of his God-given genius that elevated him above ordinary men. The intricate details of a golden button, the powerful anatomy of a bronze statue, these were not just works of art. They were declarations of his inherent superiority. But crucially, his virtù was not confined to the workshop. It had to be demonstrated in the world of men, in the face of conflict and insult. Any challenge to his artistic reputation, any slight against his personal honor, was a direct assault on his virtù, and it had to be met with overwhelming, often violent force. This is the key to his psychology. He did not see a contradiction between his art and his violence. He saw them as two expressions of the same inner fire. To sculpt a perfect figure and to execute a perfect sword thrust were both demonstrations of his mastery, his control, his virtù. His inner demon was an almost pathological sensitivity to the opinions of others, coupled with an unshakable belief in his own greatness. He believed he was a unique instrument of God, and that the normal rules of society did not apply to him. This conviction gave him the audacity to challenge the powerful, to brawl with his rivals, and to kill those he saw as his enemies. He was fighting a constant internal war to prove his worth, not just to the world, but to himself. His life was a performance, and every action, whether in the studio or the street, was designed to leave the audience of posterity in absolute awe of the great Benvenuto Cellini. In the treacherous ecosystem of Renaissance Rome, an artist's survival depended on the delicate dance of patronage. Talent was the currency, but a powerful protector was the shield. For Benvenuto Cellini, the encounter that would define the first half of his career was his relationship with Pope Clement VII, born Giulio de' Medici. This was no simple pairing of artist and employer. It was a fateful, deeply complex alliance that enabled Cellini's rise and cemented his reputation for untouchability. Clement was a Medici, a product of Florence's most powerful banking and political dynasty, and he understood the world of art and power better than anyone. He was a man of refined taste, but indecisive character, a pope who would preside over one of the greatest disasters in the city's history, the sack of Rome in 1527. He recognized Cellini's genius immediately. In the young Florentine's work, he saw the perfection and dynamism that he wanted to be the hallmark of his papacy. He showered Cellini with commissions, from minting the most beautiful coins in Europe to crafting magnificent papal regalia. But he got more than he bargained for. He did not just get an artist. He got Cellini's explosive temper, his endless feuds, and his shocking propensity for violence. Time and again, Clement was forced to intervene to save his favorite artist from the consequences of his actions. The Pope found himself in a deeply contradictory position. As the vicar of Christ, the ultimate arbiter of Christian morality, he was repeatedly extending his holy protection to a man who was, by any reasonable definition, a murderer and a thug. This alliance reveals much about the era. For a prince like Clement, an artist of Cellini's caliber was a precious asset, a tool for projecting power and securing a legacy. The Pope's glory would be reflected in the immortal masterpieces created in his name. A dead rival or two was a small price to pay for that kind of immortality. For Cellini, the Pope's patronage was a golden ticket. It gave him access, wealth, and most importantly, a get-out-of-jail-free card. He could operate with a sense of impunity that drove his rivals mad with envy and fear. This relationship was the crucible in which Cellini's dual nature was fully forged. Under the protective wing of the papacy, the artist was free to reach new heights of creative expression, while the killer was allowed to roam unchecked. The first blood is always the most significant. It is the crossing of a moral Rubicon, the moment an abstract capacity for violence becomes a concrete, irreversible act. For Benvenuto Cellini, this moment came in the streets of Rome, and the impunity with which he faced it taught him a lesson that would define the rest of his life. That for a man of his genius, the laws that governed ordinary men were merely suggestions. The victim was Pompeo de Capitaneis, a rival jeweler from Milan, who had made the fatal mistake of earning Cellini's enmity. The feud had simmered for some time, fueled by professional jealousy and public insults. According to Cellini's own account, he and a friend cornered Pompeo after a church service. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and daggers were drawn. Cellini describes the act with the cold precision of a surgeon, detailing how he thrust his dagger with such force under his rival's ear that the wound was instantly mortal. This was not a back-alley brawl that went too far. It was a targeted assassination. In the normal course of events, even in the violent world of 16th century Rome, such an act would have meant a death sentence, or, at the very least, a lifetime in exile. But Cellini was not an ordinary man. He was the Pope's favorite artist. When the authorities came for him, he sought refuge with a powerful cardinal, who promptly went to Pope Clement VII to plead his case. The Pope, a man who desperately needed Cellini's skills for a variety of important commissions, was furious at the inconvenience, but ultimately pragmatic. He famously flew into a rage, not at the murder, but at the idea that men of unique talent like Cellini should be subject to the law at all, comparing him to the great artists of antiquity. The result was a papal pardon, a stunning and public declaration that Benvenuto Cellini was above the law. This event was a psychological turning point. It confirmed for Cellini what he had always believed in his heart. His genius was a divine gift that set him apart from the herd. The price of his power to create was a license to destroy. He had looked into the abyss, killed a man in broad daylight, and had been rewarded for it. From that moment on, violence was no longer just an instinct. It was a tool, a legitimate and effective means of dealing with his problems, a right he had earned through his talent. Every great protagonist needs a great antagonist, a force of opposition that tests their limits and drives the narrative forward. While Cellini made enemies with the ease of a summer storm, his true macro-level adversaries were the Farnese family, a powerful and ruthless clan whose rise to prominence represented everything Cellini despised. The architect of the family's fortunes was Alessandro Farnese, who, through a lifetime of cunning and political maneuvering, ascended to the papal throne in 1534, taking the name Pope Paul III. The Farnese were the ultimate insiders, a dynasty of old-world aristocrats who viewed power as their birthright. They were everything Cellini was not. He was the upstart genius from a modest background, while they were the entrenched nobility who saw men like him as little more than talented servants. The conflict became intensely personal through the figure of the Pope's illegitimate son, Pier Luigi Farnese. If Cellini was a volcano of creative and destructive energy, Pier Luigi was a cesspool of corruption and sadistic cruelty. He was a man of immense power and no discernible talent, infamous for his depravity and his contempt for those he considered his inferiors. Pier Luigi developed a particular and venomous hatred for Cellini. He saw the sculptor not as a great artist, but as an insolent, low-born artisan who had been given far too much power and protection by the previous pope. He envied Cellini's talent and resented his defiant attitude. When his father became pope, Pier Luigi saw his chance to destroy the man he so despised. The Farnese represented a systemic threat to Cellini. They were the embodiment of a corrupt power structure that sought to control and exploit genius rather than celebrate it. Their conflict was not just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of worldviews. It was the battle of the individualistic, meritocratic artist against the nepotistic, aristocratic machine. Pope Paul III and his monstrous son would become the architects of Cellini's darkest hour, the force that would strip him of his papal protection and subject him to the most profound humiliation of his life. For a man who lived his life on a knife's edge, a fall was inevitable. But when it came, it was not a swift execution in a public square, but the slow, grinding horror of a dungeon. Cellini's fatal mistake was believing his own myth of untouchability. underestimating the depth of the Farnese family's hatred for him. After the death of his protector, Pope Clement VII, and the ascension of Pope Paul III, his world turned upside down. Pier Luigi Farnese, the new pope's son, wasted no time in setting a trap. He leveled a trumped-up charge against Cellini, accusing him of embezzling papal jewels during the chaos of the sack of Rome years earlier. It was a baseless accusation, but in the new political climate, it was enough. Benvenuto Cellini, the celebrated artist and papal favorite, was arrested and thrown into the Castel Sant'Angelo. The irony was devastating. He was now a prisoner in the very fortress he had so heroically defended. This was the great breaking point of his life. He was stripped of his workshop, his tools, his freedom, and his identity. He was no longer Cellini the genius, but just another wretch in a lightless, foul-smelling cell. The experience pushed him to the brink of madness. He endured solitary confinement, physical deprivation, and the constant psychological torment of knowing his fate was in the hands of his most hated enemy. Yet, even in this abyss, his indomitable will refused to be extinguished. He planned and executed a daring, almost unbelievable escape, using knotted bedsheets to rappel down the fortress walls, only to break his leg in the fall. He was inevitably recaptured, a wounded animal dragged back to his cage. The second imprisonment was even worse. He was cast into a secret dungeon, a pit of utter darkness and despair. This period of absolute helplessness was a forge. It burned away any remaining naivete and hardened his soul into something akin to tempered steel. He emerged from that dungeon a different man, more paranoid, more cynical, and consumed by a burning, incandescent hatred for the Farnese and the unjust world that had tried to crush him. His body was broken, but his spirit and his thirst for revenge were stronger than ever. Just as Cellini's world seemed to have shrunk to the 4 damp walls of his Roman dungeon, a lifeline appeared from an unexpected direction, proving the old adage that for a man who embraces chaos, the end of one chapter is merely the prelude to the next. The chaos of his imprisonment and the very public nature of his daring escape had, ironically, amplified his fame. The story of the brilliant artist languishing in a papal prison at the behest of his rivals became a cause célèbre in the courts of Europe. It was at this moment of absolute despair that an opportunity arose from across the Alps. King Francis I of France, a great patron of the arts and a bitter rival of the Holy Roman Emperor and his papal allies, saw a chance. What better way to thumb his nose at the Pope in Rome than to rescue the very artist the papacy had imprisoned? For Francis, this was a masterful stroke of cultural and political chess. He issued a formal invitation, a royal summons, for Benvenuto Cellini to come to France and enter his service. The political pressure was immense, and Pope Paul III, reluctant to antagonize the French king, was eventually forced to release his famous prisoner. Plucked from the depths of his Roman disgrace, Cellini crossed the Alps into a new world. This was his great rebirth. He left behind the stinking dungeons and the treacherous politics of Rome for the opulent and glittering court of Fontainebleau. King Francis offered him not just freedom, but a grander stage than he had ever known. He was given a handsome salary, a workshop, and a level of artistic freedom he had only dreamed of. The king did not want a mere craftsman. He wanted a star, a living embodiment of the Italian Renaissance to adorn his court. This dramatic reversal of fortune was not lost on Cellini. He saw it as the direct intervention of his personal fortuna, a confirmation that he was a man of destiny. The chaos of his downfall in Rome had, paradoxically, created the opportunity for his greatest ascent. He arrived in France not as a broken man, but as a resurrected hero, ready to unleash his creative genius on an unprecedented scale and to show the world, and especially his enemies in Rome, the true measure of his virtue. The court of King Francis I at the Palace of Fontainebleau was, in the mid-16th century, the most dazzling cultural center in Northern Europe. The king, a man of immense appetite for both war and art, had set out to lure the greatest talents of the Italian Renaissance to France, transforming his favorite residence into a showcase of modern genius. It was here, in this heady atmosphere of unlimited resources and royal favor, that Benvenuto Cellini would create the single object that stands as the very pinnacle of his goldsmithing art, his undisputed masterpiece, the salt cellar of Francis I, known to the world as the Saliera. This was his moment of greatest triumph, the culmination of all his skill, ambition, and artistic vision. The Saliera is not merely a functional object for holding salt and pepper. It is a complex, allegorical sculpture, a symphony in gold and enamel. It depicts two nude figures, a male representing the sea, Neptune, and a female representing the earth, Ceres. They are seated with their legs intertwined, symbolizing the meeting of land and sea from which salt is born. Neptune rests his hand on a tiny, exquisitely detailed ship designed to hold the salt. Ceres leans against a miniature triumphal arch, which conceals a container for pepper. The base is an oval of dark enamel, adorned with allegorical figures representing the winds and the times of day. To look upon the Saliera is to witness perfection. The anatomy of the figures is flawless. The craftsmanship is so fine that it seems impossible for human hands to have achieved, and the overall conception is one of breathtaking intellectual and aesthetic harmony. In creating this object, Cellini poured every ounce of his genius into a form so pure and so beautiful that it transcended mere craftsmanship and became a legend. It was the ultimate statement of his virtù, a testament to his ability to bring divine forms into earthly existence. For a brief, brilliant period at Fontainebleau, he was not just a craftsman or even an artist. He was a cultural hero, celebrated by the king and admired by the entire court. This was the summit of the mountain, a moment of pure, unadulterated creative glory that would secure his name in the annals of art for all time. To stand at the summit of one's profession, celebrated by a king and envied by all, is a dangerous thing. For a man of Cellini's temperament, this moment of ultimate triumph was also a moment of supreme hubris. At the French court, his belief in his own singular genius metastasized into outright arrogance. He no longer saw himself as a craftsman in the service of a patron. He saw himself as an equal, a prince of art whose talent placed him on the same level as the blue-blooded aristocrats around him. He lorded his status over the other artists at court, treating them with open contempt. He demanded a large staff, ran his workshop like a personal fiefdom, and spent the king's money with abandon. His behavior was a constant source of friction. The French court had its own rigid etiquette and its own powerful factions, and Cellini, the fiery Italian upstart, trampled over them all with blissful indifference. His most powerful enemy at Fontainebleau was the king's official mistress, the Duchesse d'Étampes. She had her own favored artists and saw Cellini as an arrogant interloper. They clashed repeatedly, with Cellini, in a staggering display of audacity, openly defying her and complaining about her directly to the king. He believed his direct line to Francis I made him invulnerable. This was the psychology of his triumph. He felt that his transcendent talent absolved him of all need for diplomacy, humility, or even basic courtesy. He was, in his own mind, a force of nature, a divine instrument of creation, and the petty squabbles of courtiers were beneath him. This period, while artistically his most productive, sowed the seeds of his eventual departure from France. His inability to navigate the complex social landscape, his refusal to play the courtly game, and his absolute conviction that his genius gave him a pass for any transgression made him an impossible colleague and a troublesome subject. He had reached the pinnacle of his fame and power, but in his hubris, he was building his own funeral pyre, alienating the very people whose support he would need when the king's favor inevitably began to wane. He had won the artistic war, but he was losing the political one, a distinction his pride would never allow him to grasp. Every hero's journey is defined by his nemesis, the dark shadow that gives his own light meaning. For Cellini, this sworn enemy was Pier Luigi Farnese, the Duke of Parma, and the bastard son of Pope Paul III. Their conflict was more than a simple rivalry. It was a visceral, personal vendetta, a clash between two fundamentally opposing forces. Pier Luigi was the antithesis of Cellini's concept of virtù. He was a man who had been given everything, wealth, titles, power, by virtue of his birth, not through any discernible talent or merit of his own. He was infamous throughout Italy for his corruption, his brutality, and his sexual depravity. While Cellini sought to create objects of immortal beauty, Pier Luigi seemed dedicated only to his own grotesque appetites. In Cellini's eyes, Pier Luigi was the embodiment of the corrupt, decadent aristocracy that he so despised, a parasite who fed on the body politic while producing nothing of value. The hatred was intensely personal, forged in the darkness of the Castel Sant'Angelo. It was Pier Luigi who had orchestrated Cellini's imprisonment, who had gloated over his suffering, and who had intended for him to rot in that dungeon forever. For Cellini, Pier Luigi was not just an enemy. He was a monster, a stain on the honor of mankind. Cellini's autobiography drips with venom whenever he mentions the Duke's name. He recounts with lurid detail the stories of Pier Luigi's atrocities, most famously the rape of Fano, a notorious incident of sexual violence against a young bishop. He paints a portrait of a man so utterly vile that his eventual assassination, he was stabbed to death by his own nobleman in 1547, is presented by Cellini as an act of divine justice. The chemistry of their relationship was one of pure antipathy. Pier Luigi saw in Cellini an insolent, low-born upstart who refused to show him the proper deference. Cellini saw in Pier Luigi a tyrannical buffoon whose power was entirely unearned. Their feud represents the central conflict of Cellini's life narrative, the struggle of individual genius against the oppressive weight of a corrupt and arbitrary power structure. Pier Luigi was the dragon Cellini had to slay, if only in the pages of his own epic story. After his tumultuous years in France, Cellini returned to his native Florence, entering the service of another powerful Medici, Duke Cosimo I. This marked a new phase in his life. If his time in France was about creating exquisite, portable masterpieces for a king, his work for Duke Cosimo was about forging a monumental public legacy in his home city. This was his chance to prove that he was not just a goldsmith, but a sculptor on a grand scale, the equal of Donatello and his contemporary, Michelangelo. His great commission, the one that would consume him for nearly a decade, was to create a colossal bronze statue for the city's main public square, the Piazza della Signoria. The subject was Perseus, the Greek hero, holding aloft the severed head of the Gorgon Medusa. For Duke Cosimo, the statue was a potent piece of political propaganda, symbolizing the Duke's own power in having cut the head off the city's fractious Republican past. For Cellini, it was the ultimate artistic challenge, a chance to immortalize his name in the same space as the great works of the Florentine masters. This period was his most significant as a constructor. He established a large foundry and workshop near the Duke's palace, a fiery, chaotic laboratory where he would battle with the complex and dangerous art of bronze casting. He was no longer just an artist. He was an engineer, an inventor, and the demanding foreman of a large team of assistants. This project was a war on a different front. Instead of fighting papal politics or courtly rivals, he was fighting the very laws of physics and chemistry, struggling to melt and pour thousands of pounds of molten metal to create a perfect, seamless form. The creation of the Perseus was his peacetime equivalent of a great military campaign. It required meticulous planning, immense resources, and an iron will to overcome countless setbacks. It was his effort to build something permanent, to anchor his turbulent life story in a tangible, unmovable monument that would stand for centuries as a testament to his genius and his indomitable spirit. To truly understand the man, we must look beyond the studio and the dueling ground and into the more intimate corners of his life. These details, the onions and vegetables of his story, add the crucial context and flavor to the main narrative of his triumphs and catastrophes. Central to this is his personal life, which was every bit as dramatic and unconventional as his public one. He was a man of voracious appetites, and his relationships were a revolving door of models, muses, and lovers, both male and female. He fathered at least 8 children with various women, showing a sporadic and often neglectful paternal affection. His sexuality was a subject of constant scandal. He was formally accused of sodomy on at least 3 separate occasions, a crime that could carry the death penalty. While he escaped serious punishment, these accusations reveal a side of his life that existed in the shadows, a world of clandestine encounters that stood in stark contrast to his public obsession with masculine honor. Perhaps his most significant secondary creation, after his artworks, was his own autobiography, the Vita. Begun in his later years, this book is an unparalleled window into his mind, but it is a window with distorted glass. The Vita is not a dispassionate account. It is a masterpiece of self-mythologizing. In its pages, Cellini casts himself as the infallible hero of his own epic. His triumphs are magnified, his enemies are demonized, his crimes are justified, and his genius is presented as a force of nature before which all should bow. He embellishes, he exaggerates, and he likely invents whole conversations and events to fit his narrative. It is through this book that we learn of his supernatural visions in prison, his conversations with ghosts, and his belief that he was constantly protected by a divine halo visible only to himself. The Vita is both an invaluable historical document and a brilliant piece of propaganda. It shows that Cellini's final and most enduring artistic project was the creation of his own legend, a story so powerful and so compelling that it has shaped our perception of him for centuries, ensuring that we see him as he saw himself, a flawed but ultimately transcendent hero. Even as he labored on his great Florentine masterpiece, the Perseus, the first cracks began to appear in his grand edifice of self-assurance. The path to immortality was fraught with new and insidious threats. The primary source of this pressure was the Florentine court itself. While Duke Cosimo I was his patron, the court was a nest of intrigue, and Cellini's abrasive personality had made him a host of powerful enemies. His chief rival was the sculptor Baccio Bandinelli, a competent but less talented artist who was a master of courtly politics. Bandinelli never missed an opportunity to undermine Cellini, whispering criticisms of his work and his character into the Duke's ear. He represented a different path to success, not through raw, confrontational genius, but through flattery, connections, and strategic maneuvering. This rivalry was a constant drain on Cellini's energy and resources, forcing him to fight a two-front war, one in the foundry against the physical challenges of his sculpture, and another in the palace against the poison of courtly conspiracy. Furthermore, the sheer scale of the Perseus project was a source of immense stress. The technical challenges of casting a bronze statue of that size were enormous, and any failure would be a very public and very expensive humiliation. The Duke's patience and his treasury were not infinite. The project was plagued by delays and cost overruns, providing ample ammunition for his rivals. Ominous portents seemed to be everywhere. He was beset by lawsuits from disgruntled assistants and former lovers. His health, for the first time in his robust life, began to show signs of strain under the relentless pressure. The world was closing in on him. The freedom he had enjoyed as a young man in Rome and the celebrated status he held in France were gone. He was now a middle-aged artist in a city full of enemies, his entire reputation staked on a single, monumentally difficult project. The harbingers of the storm were gathering, and Cellini, for all his bravado, could feel the changing weather. He was no longer the unstoppable force of nature. He was a man gambling everything on one final desperate roll of the dice. The moment of truth arrived on a stormy night in Florence. The casting of the Perseus was not merely an artistic act, it was a climactic battle, a fateful performance where Cellini wagered his entire legacy. This single event perfectly encapsulates the psychology of the man, his tendency to court disaster, and then, through sheer force of will, snatch victory from its jaws. The process began with the melting of tons of bronze in his specially built furnace. The heat was immense, a man-made volcano in the heart of the city. But then, disaster struck, the weather turned, and a torrential downpour began to cool the workshop, threatening the delicate process. Simultaneously, the molten metal in the furnace began to coagulate, to clot into a useless mass. His assistants panicked, certain that the project was doomed. Cellini himself, overcome by the physical and emotional strain, was struck by a sudden, violent fever and was forced to his bed, believing himself to be on the point of death. This was the abyss, the moment of total failure. But then, something inside him snapped. Lying in what he thought was his deathbed, he heard a tremendous crash from the workshop. Convinced that his life's work was collapsing, he was seized by a final, desperate surge of energy. He leaped from his bed, terrifying his household staff, and stormed back into the foundry. What he found was chaos. The furnace had overheated. The metal was ruined. This is where the fateful act occurred, a decision born not of calculation, but of pure, primal instinct. He began shouting orders, his feverish energy electrifying the terrified workshop. He commanded his assistants to throw more fuel on the fire, to raise the temperature to impossible levels. When that wasn't enough, he committed the ultimate act of creative sacrifice. He ran into his house and began grabbing every piece of pewter he owned, his plates, his bowls, his cutlery, some 200 pieces in all, and started hurling them into the molten bronze. The tin in the pewter acted as a flux, miraculously liquefying the clotted metal. The furnace roared back to life with such ferocity that it set the workshop roof on fire. Amidst the rain, the fire, and the explosions of gas from the mold, they finally tapped the furnace, and the glowing liquid bronze flowed into the cast, perfectly filling every crevice of the Medusa's head and Perseus's heroic form. He had faced utter catastrophe and had triumphed not through careful planning, but through a fit of glorious, destructive madness. It was a perfect metaphor for his life. Creation born from chaos, beauty forged in the heart of a firestorm. While the casting of the Perseus was his greatest artistic climax, the broader arc of his life reveals a different kind of catastrophe, a slow, creeping moral corrosion. There was no single event, no great battle of malady or failed coronation that marked his downfall. Instead, his greatest catastrophe was the cumulative weight of his own transgressions, a lifetime of violence that ultimately left him an isolated and embittered old man. The litany of his crimes is staggering. He committed at least 3 murders that are documented, and likely more. He was involved in countless brawls and assaults, describing with relish how he broke the arms and legs of his enemies. He was repeatedly accused of theft and embezzlement. The charges of sodomy, which he faced in both Florence and Paris, painted a picture of a man who took what he wanted, sexually and otherwise, with little regard for consent or consequence. The true nature of this catastrophe was not legal, for he managed to escape serious punishment for most of his life, shielded by his talent and his powerful patrons. The catastrophe was psychological and spiritual. His violence, which he had always justified as a necessary defense of his honor and virtue, eventually became a prison. It earned him a reputation as a dangerous and unstable man, making it increasingly difficult for him to find patrons and collaborators who were willing to tolerate his behavior. He was feared, but he was not loved. He was admired for his talent, but he was distrusted as a man. The unveiling of the Perseus in the Piazza della Signoria was an unmitigated public triumph. The crowds roared their approval, and his rival Bandinelli was forced to concede his genius. But what should have been the dawn of a new era of respectability was, in reality, a gilded sunset. This triumph was built upon a foundation of blood, intimidation, and sin. He had proven he could create a god, but in the process, he had revealed himself to be all too brutally human. The moral catastrophe was his inability to see this, his complete lack of remorse. In his own eyes, he remained the hero, but to the world, he was becoming a monstrous relic of a more savage age. The final act of a dramatic life is often not a thunderous explosion, but a slow, quiet fading. After the triumph of the Perseus, Cellini's career entered a long, painful decline. The war of his life, which he had fought with such ferocious energy, was ending in a grinding siege of old age, lawsuits, and creeping obscurity. His patron, Duke Cosimo I, while pleased with the statue, grew tired of Cellini's constant demands, his endless feuds, and his scandalous behavior. The Duke began to favor other, younger, and more manageable artists, like Giambologna, whose elegant mannerist style was coming into fashion. Cellini was increasingly sidelined, given minor commissions, or passed over entirely. This was a psychological blow from which he would never recover. For a man whose entire identity was built on being the greatest, the most sought-after artist of his time, becoming a secondary figure was a kind of living death. His workshop, once a bustling hive of activity, grew quiet. He was entangled in a web of endless legal battles, disputes with patrons over payment, lawsuits from former assistants, and continued fallout from his violent encounters. The man who had faced down popes and kings now found himself bogged down in the petty, humiliating world of depositions and court appearances. This was the collapse. It was not a sudden fall from a great height, but the slow, agonizing erosion of his status and his self-worth. His last chance to hold on to power and relevance was to fight on a new battlefield, the page. He began dictating his autobiography, the Vita. It was a desperate, final attempt to control the narrative, to shape his own legacy before it was too late. If the world would no longer commission his sculptures, he would sculpt his own myth, creating a monument of words that would, he hoped, outlast bronze. The fiery warrior of the Renaissance was slowly transforming into an old man, raging against the dying of the light, his final weapon, not a dagger or a chisel, but a story. The end came not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield or in a dark alley, but quietly, in a bed in his beloved and hated Florence. Benvenuto Cellini died on the 13th of February, 1571, at the age of 70. For a man who had lived such a turbulent and violent life, who had survived wars, plagues, imprisonment, and countless duels, the irony was that he died of natural causes. His finale was not an operatic crescendo, but a quiet fade to black. He was given a grand funeral and buried with honors in the Church of the Santissima Annunziata, a public acknowledgement of his status as one of Florence's great artistic sons. The final act of his life, however, was not his death, but the completion of his memoirs. In his last years, as his hands grew too weak to wield a hammer, he poured all of his remaining energy into dictating his life story. This was his last great performance, his final battle in the war for his own legacy. He crafted a narrative in which he was the central heroic figure, a man of destiny buffeted by the slings and arrows of lesser, envious men. He meticulously recorded his triumphs, justified his crimes, and settled old scores with a pen that was every bit as sharp as his dagger had been. The circumstances of his end bring his story full circle. The man who began his career seeking the approval of powerful patrons ended it by becoming his own ultimate patron, commissioning from himself a literary self-portrait that would ensure his version of the truth would be the one that endured. He understood that physical monuments could crumble and that the memory of men could fade, but that a powerful story, once told, could become immortal. His last great act was to put down his chisel and pick up his voice, transitioning from a creator of objects to a creator of myth, ensuring that the world would not just remember his art, but would be forced to contend with the beautiful, terrible, and utterly unforgettable man who made it. Benvenuto Cellini's legacy is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the profound complexity of the man and his work. For centuries, he has been an object of both fascination and revulsion, and how one views him often depends on the lens through which one looks. Is he a sublime artist who happened to be a thug, or a thug who was blessed with an inexplicable gift for art? The conflict of interpretations rages on. For the art historian, he is a towering figure of the late Renaissance and Mannerism. The Saliera is considered the single most important and beautiful example of a goldsmith's secular work in history, while the Perseus is a technical and aesthetic marvel of bronze sculpture. In this view, his violent life is often treated as a colorful but secondary aspect of his story, the chaotic backdrop to his transcendent creative genius. He is the quintessential Renaissance man, embodying the era's fusion of high culture and brutal reality. For the historian and the biographer, however, the picture is darker. Reading his vita alongside contemporary legal documents and accounts reveals a man who was not just hot-tempered, but was very likely a clinical narcissist or a sociopath. His violence was not merely defensive, it was often predatory and premeditated. His self-aggrandizing narrative is seen as the work of a profoundly unreliable narrator, a man constructing a heroic myth to cover a lifetime of crime and cruelty. In this interpretation, his art is not an expression of a divine soul, but the product of a monstrous ego, a way of asserting his dominance and superiority over the rest of humanity. Then there is the popular imagination, which has often romanticized him. He has been cast as the ultimate rebel artist, the defiant individualist fighting against a corrupt establishment. This view, popularized by novels and even an opera by Berlioz, celebrates his swagger, his passion, and his refusal to bow to convention, often glossing over the uglier aspects of his character. He becomes a symbol of artistic freedom, a hero whose sins are forgiven because of the beauty he brought into the world. These conflicting views are not mutually exclusive. The truth of Cellini is that he was all of these things at once. He was a creator of divine beauty and a perpetrator of ugly violence. He was a quintessential man of his time and a deeply disturbed individual. His legacy is not a stable monument, but a shimmering, multifaceted crystal that reflects a different, often unsettling image from every angle. So we return to the central dramatic paradox of Benvenuto Cellini. Why did the genius who forged masterpieces also kill people? Why was his life a constant state of war? The final comprehensive answer is that for him, and for the violent, brilliant age in which he lived, there was no paradox at all. The separation we make between the artist and the man, between the act of creation and the act of violence, is a modern sensibility. Cellini would not have understood it. He lived in a world where the same force, the same inner fire, fueled both impulses. The answer lies in that single, untranslatable word: virtù. For him, virtù was the unified theory of everything. It was the assertion of the self against a hostile and chaotic world. To create the Saliera was an act of virtù. It was to impose a perfect divine order onto raw, formless metal, proving his mastery over nature itself. To kill Pompeo de Capitaneus in a Roman street was also an act of virtù. It was to impose his will upon a rival who had dared to challenge his honor, proving his mastery in the world of men. He did not see these as contradictory actions, performed by two different parts of his personality. He saw them as the same muscle being flexed in different arenas. His life was a war because he perceived existence as a constant struggle for dominance. Dominance over his materials, dominance over his rivals, dominance over his patrons, and dominance over his own fate. He was not broken by this conflict. He was fueled by it. Every insult, every obstacle, every technical challenge was a new enemy to be conquered, a new opportunity to demonstrate his virtù. What drove him to sculpt angels was the same thing that drove him to wield a dagger, a ferocious, insatiable, and terrifying ego, a belief in his own genius so absolute that he felt entitled to create his own moral universe, a universe in which beauty was the ultimate justification for brutality. The life of Benvenuto Cellini is more than just the biography of a single, extraordinary man. It is a profound and disturbing lesson on the nature of genius, power, and morality. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question that echoes through the ages. Does the creation of transcendent beauty grant a license for monstrous behavior? What is the ultimate verdict of history on a man who gives the world immortal art, but does so with blood on his hands? Cellini stands as a monument to the terrifying idea that the creative and destructive impulses in the human soul are not polar opposites, but are deeply, perhaps inextricably, intertwined. He demonstrates that the same passion, the same ego, the same ferocious will to leave a mark on the world can lead to the creation of a masterpiece or the commission of a crime. He is a testament to an era that celebrated the glorious individual, the uomo universale, often without scrutinizing the moral cost of that glory. His life was a product of the Italian Renaissance, an age of breathtaking light and profound darkness, an age that produced Leonardo da Vinci and Cesare Borgia from the same cultural soil. The universal lesson of his life is a warning against the romanticization of genius. It reminds us that great art can emerge from a troubled and even a wicked soul, and that we must be careful not to let the brilliance of the creation blind us to the darkness of the Creator. He teaches us about the price of power, showing that the patronage of the great can protect and enable a man's worst instincts. And ultimately, his story is a struggle against fate, a testament to the power of a single, indomitable will, to forge a legend so powerful that it almost eclipses the terrible truth of the man behind it. The final frame of this epic saga is not of the man, but of his ghost, captured forever in bronze. Go to Florence, to the Piazza della Signoria, and stand before the Perseus with the head of Medusa. Do not look at it as a mere statue. Look at it as the man's true autobiography, his final, unvarnished confession. See the hero, Perseus, depicted with a perfect, idealized, godlike body. This is Cellini, as he saw himself, a divine instrument of victory, the hero of his own story. His face is calm, triumphant, untroubled by the violent act he has just committed. But then, look closer. Turn to the back of the helmet on Perseus's head. There, hidden in plain sight, is a secret self-portrait. The back of the helmet and the hero's flowing hair form the unmistakable features of a bearded man's face, the face of Benvenuto Cellini himself. He has literally embedded himself within his creation, the artist hiding inside the mind of his triumphant killer. And what is this hero doing? He is holding aloft the severed head of Medusa, her face a mask of beautiful agony, her hair a nest of writhing serpents. This is the masterpiece born of violence, the perfect form born from a monstrous act. The statue is a perfect, chilling metaphor for its creator, a sublime work of art that is also a monument to a brutal killing. It stands there today, in the heart of Florence, gleaming under the Tuscan sun, a beautiful monster, the delicious, terrifying, and eternal kebab that is the legacy of Benvenuto Cellini.